In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the theory of social representations. The theory of social representations is associated with this man, Serge Moscovici. Moscovici is one of the most well-respected social psychologists of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Moscovici was born in Romania in 1925. His family were Jewish, and his education was interrupted because of anti-Semitism in Romanian schools. During the Second World War, he joined the Romanian Communist Party. After some time in the Communist Party, he experienced increased anti-Semitism and felt increasingly uncomfortable. Eventually, after a period in which he helped Jews to leave Romania, he himself left and, after further travel, ended up in the late 40s in France. In France, he started studying psychology at the Sorbonne, and he came under the influence of Daniel Lagache, a psychoanalyst, and Alexander Koyré, a philosopher of science. Let's turn to Moscovici's general theoretical background. As I mentioned, Moscovici had been a member of the Communist Party, but it seems he was never terribly comfortable as a communist. Lenin famously had distrusted common sense and argued that the masses were in a state of so-called false consciousness. This meant that they couldn't really understand their own situation. It needed to be explained to them by a revolutionary vanguard. So basically for these communists, people didn't really have a good understanding of their own lives. The proper understanding had to be given to them by the communist theoreticians, the communist elite. This distrust of common sense was held by many psychologists. Psychoanalysts argue that our underlying motivations, the way in which we engage in relationships with others, have deep unconscious motives. And we're not aware of these motives in our everyday life. To uncover them, we need intensive psychoanalysis. The behaviorists also distrusted common sense. In our common sense language, we talk about consciousness, we talk about beliefs, our wants, our desires. The behaviorists argued you could explain human behavior without using our normal everyday terms. And it seems that Moscovici had a greater respect for common sense, everyday understandings. When he developed his theory, he wanted to put this at the forefront of his thinking. So instead of derogating, instead of getting rid of common sense understandings, this was to be the topic of his work. And Moscovici was working in France, and as a French psychologist, he was very much in a minority. Psychology wasn't particularly popular as an academic subject, so his major problem was to introduce psychology to the French social sciences. When he went to America to study at the Ernst Institute at Princeton, his problem was somewhat different. What he found there were psychologists who were really not very interested in the broad social sciences. So Moscovici, in a way, points in two directions. He's introducing psychology to the European social sciences, and he's trying to introduce the social sciences to the psychology of America and, I suppose, the United Kingdom. He read the literature, which is predominantly American, and he argued that the American literature had some shortcomings. In particular, he argued that American psychology was guilty of what he called conformity bias. We'll talk about this conformity bias in a moment. He was also critical of attitude research. As you know from second year lectures, attitudes have been one of the dominant topics of social psychology in the 20th century. As Thurstone, Likert, and colleagues developed new and better measures of attitudes, attitude studies became ubiquitous. But Moscovici argued that we didn't actually learn a lot by looking at the results and lots of attitude surveys. They gave us more or less a fragmented view, but he argued that the way in which attitudes are expressed and generated, they have some kind of underlying order. Without understanding that underlying order and generative mechanism, you didn't really understand anything. So lots of attitude studies, he argued, were not particularly interesting. So now we know a little more about the general background to Moscovici's research. How did he put these general theoretical interests together into research programs? Well, as we'll see, Moscovici is famous and influential on two fronts which are nevertheless closely related. First, his research on minority influence, and second, his research on social representations. We'll turn first to his research on minority influence. Getting back to this idea of conformity bias, from our second year studies we know that the famous experimental tasks designed by Muzaffar Sherif and by Solomon Asch could be explained in terms of informational and normative social influence. Informational social influence explains the Sherif autokinetic effects, because people are put into a situation which is ambiguous. They have a kind of information deficit. They look to other people to meet that deficit, and in doing so are influenced. This is compared with the Asch studies, where people conform to something which is obviously wrong simply because they're worried about the consequences of going against what seems to be a unanimous social norm. So informational and normative influence explains the Asch and the Sherif effects, and there's a general suggestion that all of these influence processes lead to convergence. They lead to conformity. And this is an important thing in the literature. It seems that conformity is a way of rubbing away all of the sharp edges and bringing people together. Groups tend towards convergence. But Moscovici argued that, of course, this is only a partial understanding of what happens, because clearly, patently, there is attitude change, there is social change. And if all processes lead to conformity, if all processes lead to people becoming more like each other in terms of their attitudes, beliefs, and opinions, how could you account for social change? So he argued that the American theoretical research was guilty of this conformity bias. They were overlooking the importance of innovation and social change. He said that this conformity bias was based on a model which saw society as a kind of functional whole, with different parts of society having different functions, but basically all working together to maintain society as a kind of quasi-living system. He argued that the assumptions were that society was homogeneous, so society was similar in its different levels and structures. The assumption was that conformity is adaptive, it's a good thing, but non-conformity is maladaptive. If people don't conform, then it threatens the whole social structure. So non-conformity is maladaptive, non-conformity is deviance. So there's a great interest in deviance. And the basic direction of influence is from majorities to minorities. But Moscovici argued that, well, society isn't homogeneous. Society is actually stratified, and if you look more closely, or with a more sensitive eye, you'll find that groups in society are engaged in all sorts of conflicts and arguments. So there isn't a kind of overarching whole. You find that society is made up of different groups with different interests, and these interests don't necessarily match each other. He argues that conformity isn't always a good thing, it doesn't always lead to adaptation. He argues that conformity can actually lead to situations which are dangerous. Think about things like the Milgram studies. Conformity can lead to people doing cruel and horrendous acts. Conformity can be maladaptive. Nonconformity, challenging authority, introducing new ways of thinking, new ways of organizing ourselves, may well be adaptive. And clearly, according to Moscovici, minorities can influence majorities. So how was he going to demonstrate this? Well, he's arguing from a theoretical perspective through his critiques that there's this conformity bias. The language of American psychology was experimental. If he wanted to challenge these underlying assumptions, he would need to challenge in that language. So Moscovici is, I suppose, first of all famous for his experimental studies of minority influence, the so-called blue-green studies. So let's go through those. So in these experimental setups, the basic position is something like this. Keep in mind what you learned last year about Sharif and Ash. Sharif and Ash were about majorities influencing minorities. In Moscovici's studies, the Confederates are in the minority and the participants are in the majority. So here, for example, we have 6 people in the experimental situation. 5 coloured blue are the participants, and 1 coloured green is the Confederate, Moscovici's stooge. So what happens in the studies, in the experiments, are that everyone are shown blue slides. So ask the question, what colour is this slide? And it's obviously blue. The Confederate, the minority, he or she says that this obviously blue slide is green. So what Moscovici wants to find out is what happens when a majority of people who can recognize a blue slide are faced with a single person or 2 people who make a statement which is obviously false. What color is this slide? It's green. So that's the first part of the experiment. This is followed up with a second part. In the second part, which the participants think is a completely separate task, they're faced with a coloured slide which is in between blue and green. So it's greeny blue, bluey green. And they're asked, what colour is this slide? So let's get to the results. In a series of experiments by Moscovici and Lage in 1976, they compared directly the Ash situation with the minority influence situation. So there are various conditions: a consistent minority of 1, consistent minority of 2, an inconsistent minority of 1, i.e. the stooge sometimes will say that the slide is blue, sometimes they'll say it's green, an inconsistent minority of 2, a consistent majority of 4. So this is similar to the Ash study, and an inconsistent majority of 4. So sometimes they'll say it's blue, sometimes they'll say it's green. So what did Moscovici and Lage discover? Well, I think there are 2 things to look at closely here. First of all, that the consistent majority of 4, the analogue of the Ash situation, produces the most social influence, 40.16% of subjects influenced. If the majority are inconsistent, the percentage of subjects influenced, participants influenced, drops to 12%. That's what we'd expect from studying Ash and Sharif. The inconsistent minority of 1, this produces very little influence. The inconsistent minority of 2, again, produce very little influence. The consistent minority of 1 produces no better than the control, but it's this figure here. The consistent minority of 2 this produces the most this produces 10% of participants being influenced. So overall, the majority influence is greater than the minority influence, but if you have a consistent of minority of 2, we get definite, significant social influence. So a minority are clearly influencing a majority. And this is what Moscovici wanted to demonstrate. Using similar kinds of experiments that were prevalent in the literature, these kinds of perceptual judgment tasks, he's shown that minorities can indeed influence majorities. In the second part of the experiment, when he looked at people's judgments of the bluey-green and greeny-blue slides, what he found was that the perceptual code changed only for the consistent minority of 2 condition. What that means is that those people who'd been exposed to a consistent minority who'd said the blue slides were green, when later they were asked to judge the bluey-green, greeny-blue slides, they were influenced that they thought that they were more likely to state that they were green. So Moscovici is arguing on the basis of this evidence that minority influence isn't like normative influence in that it only lasts for the duration of an experiment, but instead it produces real change. These participants saw the world in, as it were, a greeny code. However, it should be noticed that this has been difficult to replicate. You can demonstrate minority influence easily enough, but to demonstrate that perceptual code changes has proved to be more difficult. So Moscovici has given us empirical evidence that minorities can influence majorities. Let's turn back to his critique of attitude studies. Moscovici argued that attitude research had become obsessed with measurement and had lost its interest in theory. He argued that attitudes were considered as the property of individuals, so each of us has his or her own set of attitudes, but there'd been little research on where these attitudes come from, how these attitudes are changed, and specifically how these attitudes are changed in terms of communication. He argued that attitude research had become decontextualized. For Moscovici, it was more interesting to ask where attitudes come from and how attitudes are transformed. What are the dynamics of attitudes? Instead of retreating into the laboratory, look at how attitudes circulate in society. Where do people's judgments come from? In his critique published in 1963, he briefly mentioned his own theory in the last part of the paper. So there's a paragraph where he introduces his notion of social representations. And Moscovici says that social representations is an approach which subsumes attitudes. Instead of just looking at the attitudes of individuals, we can look at how attitudes are embedded in communities, in groups, and in society. So this is bringing us to the birth of social representation theory, and that's going to be the focus of part 2 of my online lecture.